Not every paused energy project is pausing for the same reason. The capital pause has a single name, but at least four different causes. Treating them as one problem leads to responses that fit none of them, and in some cases makes the underlying issue worse. When a clean energy or infrastructure project stalls in 2026, the instinct is to reach for a single explanation. The environment is uncertain, capital is tight, the market is pausing. That framing is not wrong, but it is not specific enough to act on. A project stopped by tariff-driven cost increases needs a different response than one stopped by a permitting delay. A financing gap has different remedies than a policy uncertainty problem. The organizations managing through this cycle most effectively are the ones that have correctly identified which problem they actually have. Four distinct forces are stalling projects right now, often simultaneously, and often in ways that are easy to conflate. Separating them matters because each one has a different timeline, a different set of actors who can resolve it, and a different strategic response. Tariffs, a cost problem, with no waiting it out strategy. The tariff impact on infrastructure project economics is direct and cumulative. Producer price indexes for aluminum mill shapes and steel mill products rose 39.1% and 20.9% respectively from February 2025 to February 2026, according to the Associated General Contractors of America, AGC, the largest year-over-year increases since the supply chain disruptions of 2022. Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum were raised to 50% for most countries in June 2025. Certain Chinese solar products face combined tariff rates that can exceed 150%, depending on product category and applicable trade measures, including Section 301 tariffs, anti-dumping and countervailing duties, and reciprocal tariff additions. While Vietnam and Cambodia face baseline U.S. reciprocal tariffs of 46% and 49% respectively, their solar exports to the U.S. are actually hit by far higher anti-dumping duties that stretch into the hundreds and sometimes thousands of percent. The AGC's chief executive put the practical consequence plainly. There is a limit to how many price increases the market can absorb before owners put projects on hold. The tariff problem does not resolve by waiting. The rates are in place. Supply chain rerouting adds its own 10 to 15% in transportation costs, and projects that were designed around pre-tariff material pricing need to be repriced before they can close. For finance teams, the question is whether the revised cost structure still supports the original return assumptions, and if not, whether redesign, substitution of materials, or renegotiation of offtake pricing is viable before the project is abandoned rather than paused. Permitting, a timeline problem that compounds with every other problem. Federal permitting delays are a distinct problem from tariffs, but they interact with every other one. A project facing cost pressure from tariffs, while also sitting in federal environmental review, has two clocks running simultaneously, and the permitting clock has no defined endpoint. The Crux survey of 50 clean energy developers, published in April 2026, found that every respondent had at least one project materially affected by federal permitting in the prior 12 months, with roughly 11 gigawatts GW of capacity affected in aggregate. The most common delay was 3 to 6 months, affecting 46% of respondents. Another 34% faced delays of 6 to 12 months. The strategic response to a permitting problem is fundamentally different from the response to a cost problem. Nearly 80% of developers in the Crux survey said they are now deliberately citing projects to avoid triggering federal permitting requirements, accepting suboptimal resource locations, or more expensive interconnection positions to reduce regulatory exposure. Importantly, permitting delays are often invisible in headline deployment data because projects can remain in development pipelines for years before cancellation or completion becomes visible. For corporate buyers, the permitting problem surfaces differently, as schedule uncertainty and contracted supply. A power purchase agreement, PPA, with a project in federal review is a contract tied to a delivery date the developer cannot guarantee. That exposure sits on the buyer's balance sheet whether or not it is labeled as such. Financing, a structural problem that has been misread as a cyclical one. Several recent changes to the financing environment appear structural rather than purely cyclical, particularly those tied to tax credit eligibility, supply chain restrictions, and project qualification requirements. The most common mistake is treating the current credit conditions as a cycle that will normalize on its own. Recent federal policy changes, including revisions to clean energy tax credit eligibility under Sections 45Y and 48E, Foreign Entity of Concern (FEOC), supply chain restrictions, and construction start requirements introduced by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act (OBBBA), have materially altered project financing assumptions across portions of the renewable energy sector. Each of these changes directly affects the tax equity component of project finance. And tax equity is the capital stack layer that most affects whether a renewable energy deal closes at all. BDO's analysis of the OBBA's effect on the tax credit transfer market found that 36% of middle market tax leaders anticipate that changes to IRA energy subsidies will present significant challenges in the next 12 months. The FEOC restrictions add a supply chain compliance layer that was not present in prior financing rounds. Companies may need to shift sourcing to meet domestic content thresholds, which introduces cost increases and timeline risk that were not in the original project pro forma. According to AlixPartners, renewable developers who built investment cases around the expectation of long-term IRA tax credits and structured PPA pricing around those incentives are now operating in a market where those assumptions no longer hold. The projects that are most exposed are the ones where the financing model has not been updated since 2023. Policy uncertainty, a decision problem, not a project problem. The fourth force is different in character from the other three. Tariffs, permitting, and financing constraints are all operational obstacles with specific causes and specific remedies. Policy uncertainty is a decision environment problem. When the rules governing tax credits, construction start definitions, FEOC restrictions, and permitting timelines are subject to further change, some organizations respond by pausing decisions until clarity arrives. That pause is rational in isolation, but strategically costly when sustained, because clarity in this environment is not guaranteed to arrive on a useful timeline. Carbon Equity's post-OBBA analysis describes the core tension well. Months after implementation, portions of the market continue to await additional Treasury and IRS guidance on the physical work test as the exclusive construction start standard, FEOC supplier definitions, and the cost ratio thresholds that determine domestic content credit eligibility. Organizations waiting for complete policy clarity before committing capital may be waiting through a window in which early movers are securing permitted sites, interconnection positions, and supplier relationships at less competitive prices. AlixPartners notes that private equity firms are already pursuing renewable platforms with strong pipelines and established grid access, treating the distress in the sector as an acquisition opportunity rather than a reason to pause. Why getting the diagnosis right matters more than having the right strategy. The most consequential error organizations make in a multi-cause slowdown is applying a single response to 4 different problems. A company that treats a tariff cost problem as a policy uncertainty problem waits for regulatory clarity that will not change its material costs. A company that treats a financing structure problem as a permitting problem focuses on site selection, while its tax credit assumptions remain unexamined. The projects that are genuinely stuck in 2026 are often stuck for compounding reasons, but the path forward for each requires identifying which constraint is actually binding at the current stage of development. For executive and finance teams, the practical task is a project-by-project audit, which stalled projects are cost problems that need to be repriced, which are permitting problems that need a siting or sequencing response, which are financing problems that require the capital stack to be rebuilt under current market conditions, and which are policy uncertainty problems where the calculus is genuinely about whether to move now or wait. Those are 4 different conversations with 4 different sets of advisors. Organizations that continue to treat every delay as a generic market slowdown risk spending time on solutions that do not address the actual constraint. In a market where multiple forces are acting simultaneously, accurate diagnosis has become a competitive advantage. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.